Welcome to the GSX podcast, where we explore the evolving landscape of commodities, trading, and alternative capital. Hosted by me, Henry Walsh, and the team at Great Southern Cross Commodities, the podcast brings together market participants, managers, and investors to discuss how capital, policy, and innovation are reshaping the global commodity markets. From carbon to coffee, energy to macro, we cover the full commodity investment universe, unpacking the trends, risks, and opportunities that matter. Please note, the views and opinions expressed on the GSX podcast are those of the hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect the views of Great Southern Cross Commodities or its affiliates. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered as financial, investment, or trading advice. Listeners should conduct their own research or consult a professional advisor before making any financial decisions. Welcome to the GSX podcast. Today we have a guest from the renewable fuels industry who's had a long history through the biofuels world, renewable diesel, renewable fuels, and has a global perspective on all things in that sector. I'd like to welcome Henri-Jean, I'll mispronounce your surname, Bardon.
Yes.
The CEO and founder of Global Biodiesel. He's a commentator and analyst in the sector, and he has a great perspective on both the markets but also the industry, the investment that's required for change, and what we can do about it. And the timing couldn't be better, really, in terms of what's going on in world fuel markets, particularly with the situation in the Strait of Hormuz, and for us here in Australia, the implications of being an isolated nation with little to no domestic refining capacity. We are very much exposed to world events like this. So welcome, Henri.
Well, thank you very much, Henry. And I'm very happy to be speaking with you about this very important subject. I think it will be, as you said, even more important now than it has been, because I think we're facing basically the same issues that we were in the early 2000s, which is dependency on fossil fuels, right? And particularly imported fossil fuels. We're obviously not as dependent here in the United States as you are in Australia, but certainly even in the US, when I first started in biofuels, which was when the renewable fuel standards were actually enacted in 2006. So it goes back a long ways. The main factor at the time, it was the Republican administration, was the George Bush administration that basically forced this standard, and it was basically a condition of either the industry was going to get taxed or they were going to adopt the renewable fuel standards in order to create a domestic supply of renewable fuels.
Yeah.
So ever since 2006, I've been in this business. I actually started with ethanol, which was a product that replaced most of the octane, the alkylates that were put in gasolines, because they found that these alkylates were carcinogenic, and therefore they decided that they were going to replace it with ethanol, and this created a huge boom in the ethanol industry, and now we produce 40% of the corn produced in the United States is used for ethanol, so it goes right into fuel. So as I said, I started in ethanol, and I spent a little time in the early days of RFS here in the US, and then moved to Singapore, where I spent almost 15 years of my career in global biofuels. Again, starting with ethanol, but mostly with biodiesel. Singapore being in the heart of the palm oil industry. I spent a lot of time exporting from the Southeast Asia biodiesel to Europe, and even earlier on to the United States. That's where the flows were going for many different reasons. I mean, well, I'm not going to go into that because I think I'm going to speak about this a little bit more broadly. The Europeans were a big factor earlier on in the mid-2000s because they actually also enacted a mandate for biodiesel at that time, called the Renewable Energy Directive, the first one. I think it was in 2000, goes back to 2005. And but they grew their market much faster than the US because it was a mandate in Europe rather than a subsidized market like it was in the US. So the mandated tools were a lot more effective and therefore attracted a lot of imports because Europe is actually import dependent, a little bit like Australia, and certainly in terms of biofuels. So, that market grew significantly. I think when I started in 2006, it was the worldwide biodiesel sector was about 5 million tons, and now we're close to 80 million tons of biodiesel, right? So
Yeah,
as
it's
far as
huge
ethanol is
growth, right?
concerned, so it's enormous. It's the growth in that time period has been enormous. It hasn't been, let's say, harmonious, because of regulatory changes both in Europe and also in the United States. So the trends have been really contradictory sometimes, where the US was throttling back, whereas Europe was throttling higher. But now we have a major trend in Europe, where basically they want to move to non-crop types of feedstocks in the biofuel sector. So there's more emphasis on that. And in the US, they're trying, with the Biden administration, they were trying to follow that, but now they have made a sharp turn to go back to the original viewpoint in 2006 when they set up the renewable fuel standards to go to basically crop-based feedstocks. So that's
Yeah.
pretty much where we are today in the biofuel sector. And I think one of the countries that we often don't speak about is Indonesia. In the meantime, Indonesia has become basically the third largest biodiesel market in the world, mostly because they have decided to substitute their diesel imports with palm-based biodiesel. And they've done that very effectively, and they've moved to practically 40% blend.
It's impressive.
So,
Can I just ask a
when
question,
I first,
Henri?
yeah.
Yeah. I guess before we could get to things today, in terms of, some of the high level history that you outlined, I guess there's sort of similar, people are taking that as an analog for the renewable fuels mandates that have, come in the US and to a certain extent in Europe, and, the impact on the market when those announcements were initially made, under the Biden administration, caused huge moves in soybean oil and palm oil and other vegetable oil markets, which was very similar to the moves in corn and sugar that we saw when the biofuels announcements were made and the ethanol announcements back in the mid 2000s. I guess for the benefit of the listeners, how do you see, you know, looking back with a bit more perspective now, with hindsight on both, and now we're sort of 3 to 5 years into the renewable fuels move, and obviously 20 plus years into the original sort of mandates in the US on ethanol and in Europe. I guess what are the similarities? What are the differences before we sort of get into how, I think what's interesting to me is not so much the market dynamics, because the markets will always be volatile and priced pretty efficiently, but sort of the industry implications from the, especially the recent round of heavy investments, and some of those projects aren't looking too healthy. So I think that's an interesting area to sort of dig into a little bit more.
Yeah, it's not, Europe and US are not parallel in terms of their capex, in this sector. So the US has taken a very heavy hand in terms of, in the sense that there's obviously more money that was actually dedicated to this sector. And so there has been a lot of implication by the industry, which was because of the way the RFS is set up. It puts the burden on the refiners, all of the refiners, to pay basically for the RINs, so it's a little bit like a tax in a certain sense. So if they don't get into, so they have two choices: either they buy RINs, which are certificates showing that they have blended biofuels, or they invest into biofuels in the sense that they set up refineries, renovate refineries in order to offset the risk of this tax, because they are basically exposed to RINs, which is basically a certificate that proves that you have blended biofuels. So in the US, you are mandated, but at the same time, the RINs, which are basically like the subsidy for the farming sector, it becomes a tax for the refiners.
And it's tradable, right? RINs are tradable.
Yeah, and it is tradable, so it's a little bit more perverse in the U.S. it basically puts a lot more pressure on the industry to invest in renewable diesel or biodiesel plants. So there was a, I would say about 10 years ago, a big move by a lot of the big refiners who were always trying to buy the paper. They were just trying to position themselves and offset their exposure by buying the paper, who basically decided, hey, I'm going to go and buy a plant or build a plant. And this has happened, and very successfully. In fact, today we have, a very large nameplate capacity that is owned mostly by big refiners, including some of the oil majors. So that is something that is different in the US as opposed to Europe. In Europe, there is no subsidy. It's a pure mandate, and the Europeans have left it upon the refiners and entrepreneurs to basically build, including traders, to build basically biodiesel and ethanol plants or renewable diesel, also known as HVO plants. So the risk, the capex risk, is much greater in Europe than it is in the U.S. Because if you look at it from an investor standpoint, you're kind of like the big refiners are they're hedging their RINs exposure by basically spending money on plants, whereas in Europe they're basically buying plants and they're counting on the regulations to stay the same and the mandates to be effective, and that will not change over the course of the investment. So the risk profile of an investment in Europe is completely different than it is in the U.S.
What are the trade-offs between the two approaches, do you think? In terms of, do you think one has been more successful than the other, or they're just sort of different, got to the same outcome?
I think that the U.S. approach has been much more effective in terms of building capacity quickly, whereas the European system has had a lot of a lot of basically trials as you go. The regulations have changed. There's been a lot more hesitation from the investment groups to invest in biodiesel or ethanol in Europe because of the fact that all there is a mandate. So they don't know it. They don't know it. They don't have a essentially. If for example the Europeans take off the mandate, it's a lot easier to take off the mandate in Europe than it is in the U.S. because the U.S. it's fully legislated, and there are very strong milestones and in terms of dates. So you can pretty much, when you're building your project, have a little bit stronger anchors for the project than you have in Europe. I would say the European risk is much higher because of that.
And has that made Europe more sensitive / exposed to? I mean, they are exposed because of they don't produce crude oil itself, but in terms of available fuels, their outcome is they aren't any more protected despite having a reasonable size biofuel sector.
Yeah, well, they don't really. When you look at Europe, they are very dependent on imports of biofuels. So if you look at the market, more or less, if you put it at 15, 16 million tons in Europe, I would say that today half of it is, a little bit more, maybe 60% is produced locally, and the rest is pretty much imports. So they have
from Asia, I'm assuming.
I'm sorry, mostly from Asia, right?
Yeah.
So it makes Europe a lot more dependent. But at the same time, they have in this way managed the investment risk, in Europe, right? So meaning the entrepreneurs in Europe, or particularly traders or some of the oil majors who have had to go into this business, have basically minimized their capex in Europe by basically importing a product from Asia. So that's why you've seen all of these plants being built in Asia in order to supply Europe, right? So I think that is a difference, right? I think that the U.S., never really felt that they wanted to be dependent upon foreign producers, although you can actually register a plant for a U.S. destination under the renewable fuel standard. So there has been imports into the U.S., but now, I guess with this new administration, those imports have been pretty much cut off. But there were significant imports also into the U.S. at different times, in the last 20 years, certainly from Canada as well, because a lot of people actually build plants also on the other side of the border to take care to take advantage of canola oil as a feedstock. So there is, it's not all straightforward, but you know, as an investor, I would feel a lot more comfortable investing on the U.S. side than I would on the European side, even though there are very large projects in Europe today.
Okay. And I think you sort of touched on it before, but in 2 points. One of the issues in the renewable fuels, so the latest, industry expansion, has been the where the feedstocks come from, right? So, and that's going to split into two issues. So one, when the new renewable fuels got going in the US, a lot of the feedstock was used cooking oil, in inverted commas, coming from China, and that those imports have largely stopped, and hence the pivot back to crops. And then you also alluded to the fact Europe wants to move away from crops as feedstocks for the fuel. But the reality is, where are they going to get the feedstocks from? Are they going to, because the market's pretty efficient. So the main feedstocks, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, are tallow, used cooking oil, and vegetable oil, or from canola or soybeans or what have you, and then palm oil, effluent. I'll get some of the names wrong, but what are the other major feedstocks? And if they don't source them from crops, where's Europe going to get its feedstock from?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Earlier on, palm was basically an acceptable feedstock for both Europe and the US up to about 5 years ago. They basically, so effectively what has happened is that there has been a move especially on the European side, to move to a non-crop. But as you said, these are limited. And so it's very difficult to build an industry that grows every year, at a very high rate because of the mandates. For example, the SAF mandate is going to move from 2% to 6% in 2030, for example. It's a 4% increase. So that means you're moving from basically 1.5 million to probably 5 million tons of product. So you have to find the difference in feedstock somewhere. So in that example, SAF, which is sustainable aviation fuel, the airlines only want to use cooking oil as a feedstock. They don't even want to talk about crop-based vegetable oils. All of a sudden, because you've penned this into the legislation, you've basically increased the demand by close to 4 million tons, and from 1 year to the next. You can't do that with used cooking oil,
No.
because especially with the rules that you have set up for the definition of used cooking oil. Because at the end of the day, a lot of people talk about, and I think we should talk about this, is that waste oil, which is not just used cooking oil, but could be palm oil affluent, which is basically a byproduct of the palm oil industry. It's basically the pond rejects that are sitting in a pond outside of a palm oil mill that are being recovered. And so all of these things were not collected before the biofuels industry got involved, and then when we started moving to non-crop oils, we created a market. So the price of course, used cooking oil went up, the price of palm oil affluent went up, and so on. And all of a sudden, these supposedly byproducts, became kind of main items. And really, at the end of the day, what is so I'll give you an example of palm oil affluent. Palm oil affluent was basically the oil left on the pond that many of the managers of the palm oil mills used to pay the bonuses of the workers. So they would recover that oil, but they would resell it locally, and they would basically pay the bonuses of the workers of the plant. Management used to completely ignore it, and it was about maybe 1 to 2% of the overall yield that was being lost in the ponds. All of a sudden, when the rules changed and palm oil affluent became Annex 9 in the European directive, all of a sudden, we created artificial demand for this product. And now, they were finding palm oil affluent at every mill, but not at 1 or 2%, but at 3 to 4%, right? So instead of collecting only 3,000 tons a month, we moved from 3,000 to 250,000 tons per month of palm oil affluent that was being collected and shipped to Europe. So that kind of raised alarm bells, right? Saying, what's going on? People said, talked about fraud and so on. And and there may have been fraud. I'm not going to accuse anyone, but you cannot, how do you say, underestimate the motivation of people when you give them a good price for a product and what they're going to do, right? So they're always going to push as far as they can possibly push. And used cooking oil is the same situation, right? So, in China, why did China become a huge used cooking oil sector is because many people would go to a noodle manufacturer and they would say, hey, I'm going to give you 10,000 tons of all of your vegetable oil that you need, but you give me back all the used vegetable oil back, right? And I'm going to give you a discount for that virgin vegetable oil that I'm providing you up front, right? And so that created a new market, something that people never did. I mean, like noodle manufacturers never imagined that he would receive virgin vegetable oil for free in some cases, So that's why, things have changed to such an extent that today, what is used cooking oil? Used cooking oil is exactly what it says. It's used, right? So how used has it been, right? Is the fact that you're using it in a noodle plant the definition of used cooking oil, or is it that, food vendor on the side of the street that is basically frying with a multiple types of vegetable oil? Is that the definition of used cooking oil? Nobody really knows, honestly, right? So we have created a new market for alternative oils worldwide, not just in Asia, but first in Asia because that's where it came from. And Europe is the one who started it, and then the US basically took advantage of it because since they saw that the Europeans were getting all this used cooking oil from China, the US said, hey, we want some of that used cooking oil. And this is the reason why the US started importing used cooking oil as California started calculating the greenhouse gas content of the product. And it's important for, I guess, all your listeners to know that essentially palm oil affluent, like used cooking oil, is regarded in terms of greenhouse gases as zero. So essentially, because it's a recoverable product, it is categorized as producing zero emissions. And therefore, the only emissions of that product that you can add to it are basically the transportation. So as opposed to vegetable oil, where they calculate the crushing, they calculated what happened in agriculture, the production of the seeds, they basically calculate the entire life cycle. It's completely different for crops, and therefore, there's a huge advantage when you start calculating greenhouse gas savings or carbon intensity. There's of course an enormous advantage to
don't you think that's pretty
oils.
arbitrary though? Because I mean, used cooking oil was once new cooking oil, right?
Yeah, it is very arbitrary. But they basically are saying that it's because it's been recycled, essentially. So you've been used once. The noodle manufacturer has used the oil once. That the second use is a zero. So that the calculation of the greenhouse gas has already gone into the noodles, right? Essentially.
And I wonder why the system gets gamed, huh?
Of course, yeah. And so that's why, it has created a lot of confusion. The U.S. has now adopted the same system as Europe for carbon intensity, and as California, a low carbon fuel standard is a greenhouse gas counting system. So they calculate carbon intensity. So it's like Europe. So obviously it is pro non-crops because of this life cycle calculation, which for non-crops starts at zero.
And how do you think, in terms of how the carbon intensity of the various crops is measured? Here in Australia, there's an argument that the intensity of the carbon emissions to grow something like canola, just given our soils and climate, is a lot less than what it would be in Europe on a per tonne basis. Is that something that is regarded or disregarded? Just because to bring it to Australia, where we don't have the population, unless we all start eating KFC for 3 meals a week, to having enough used cooking oil, we have a reasonable amount of tallow, but nothing compared to the requirement for significant renewable diesel or sustainable aviation fuel industry here. Do you think some of those measurements are a little bit arbitrary and are kind of self-defeating in terms of not getting the industry off the ground in the first place?
Yeah, of course. I mean, crops in Australia, meaning the less amount of, especially for crops, the least amount of transportation, the better the carbon the better score you're going to get on carbon intensity. So I would imagine that canola is going to be the preferred crop for biodiesel in Australia. You might be able, as you say, to collect some used cooking oil and probably some tallow, because I think Australia exports a lot of tallow. Tallow is
Yeah,
considered,
export a lot, right? It's like 1.5
yeah,
million tons gets exported.
exactly. And most of that tallow actually goes to the U.S. or to Europe via different channels. But it's so from that Australia would actually have a very strong position in terms of carbon intensity because of that. Because tallow is considered also because it has a very low carbon intensity because it's considered recycling. So it's the same as used cooking oil. You start at zero practically. Not quite, but
Yeah, it's pretty
they have a
close. Yeah.
different cycle calculation for tallow. But remember you can blend canola oil together with tallow, in the process. I don't know, it's depending on what process you're using. If you're going conventional biodiesel, if you're going HVO or renewable diesel. So, Australia, as far as I know, does not have an HVO plant, right? So you probably are speaking of conventional. A conventional biodiesel plant is is actually very cheap. It's going to cost what for 250,000 ton. You're looking at $50 million. But if you're looking at an HVO plant, you're looking at 10 times that amount. So you're looking at 500 million for an HVO plant because you're using hydrogen all of a sudden. Because you're breaking the molecules. So it's a completely different investment. So you better have a very strong business case to invest 500 million. So if I had to invest into the biodiesel or renewable sector, renewable fuel sector in Australia, I would start with conventional biodiesel, and that has a lot of advantages, particularly for non-crops, because it's a lot easier to handle different batches of used cooking oil or tallows and so on. So you're able to manage batches of different types of feedstocks much more easily under in a conventional biodiesel plant as opposed to an HVO plant. Because in an
In terms
HVO
of
plant, you
the
need
emissions profile of biodiesel versus renewable diesel at the tailpipe, are reasonably different or similar? I would assume renewable diesel is better.
actually no. The renewable diesel plant is much worse. So the process because of hydrogen, the cracking, you're
Yeah.
cracking basically. So your carbon intensity is higher than a conventional biodiesel plant because in a conventional biodiesel plant you probably never go over boiling point. The esterification process is very efficient from a carbon intensity standpoint. Actually anyone can make biodiesel even at home, right? It's that simple, right? But you could
Yep.
never make renewable diesel in your house. And the reason why is because when you are cracking it, you're taking all the oxygen out. So essentially, the finished product is a carbohydrate. So sorry, it's a diesel. It's a pure diesel, right? So your output from an HVO plant is such that it blends the diesel pool very easily. So that's the reason why people go with HVO because you've taken all of the oxygen molecules out of the by basically breaking or cracking the molecules. You've taken all the oxygen out, and therefore you can blend it more easily into fossil fuels, especially with diesel. So whereas with conventional biodiesel, it's a little bit different because you're leaving oxygen in the product. So when you burn it, it burns a little bit faster. Number one, and because of the oxygen, but it burns more cleanly. Whereas with HVO, it burns about the same as diesel. So you don't get an emissions improvement like you do with conventional biodiesel. And sometimes that gets lost because nobody talks about that because everybody concentrates on carbon intensity.
Yeah, okay. So I guess because for here in Australia, like I think we have a number of potential feedstocks for whether they're biofuels or renewable fuels. So we've spoken about a few already. So canola, tallow, used cooking oil. And then, we have a reasonable sugar industry that only produces sugar, doesn't really do any ethanol. And the sugar industry here is struggling. It would be the process from ethanol to jet seems like a reasonable one, but for the amount of investment here in Australia, I just think is going to be too much. And the other problem, I think, for canola here in Australia is that, we don't have enough crushing capacity domestically to produce the oil to then have the biofuel plant or the renewable fuel plant. So there's a lot of investment required. The government's very reluctant to do anything around mandates, despite the fact most of our canola goes to Europe and gets turned into fuels anyway.
Exactly.
So, I mean, my prediction, just, assuming Australia continues on its current path, is they'll make big announcements, nothing will really happen, and we'll just start importing renewable fuels from Europe and Asia from fuels that are made from our feedstocks that we exported over there in the first place. Because we don't seem to have an industrial capacity left in this country, which is really frustrating. And I think the cost of energy here is really prohibitive here. So that's the other, it's a complicated cycle that keeps feeding on itself, right? The cost of energy means we can't produce our own energy. So at some point, maybe there'll be someone who steps up with a bit more conviction. But the politicians on both sides of here lack any sort of strategic direction.
Wasn't there a company producing ethanol called Manildra?
Yeah, correct. Australia? Yeah, so they produce some ethanol here, but they've largely got it closed down from what I know.
Okay. Yeah, I think of course it affects the entire, as I stated before, in the U.S., we grow corn. 40% of the corn grown is used for ethanol. Of course, there's an enormous industry that caters to that, and similarly on the oilseed side, there are huge crushing investments that are being made, and most of them are being done privately. There are no subsidies for building a crushing plant per se, but at the same time, there is a very strong RFS mandate, so people know that at the end of the day, they're going to be able to sell their soybean oil, and so I think from that perspective, I mean, it's a question of how long you establish the policy for. So obviously a crushing plant, takes at least 10 years to recover your capex, so you have to take all of that into consideration. Plus you have to take into consideration about where you sell the rest of the meal, the rapeseed meal. So like canola meal, I don't know where you would sell the canola meal in Australia, but I mean almost 60% of the canola seed is meal, right? So it's a very important factor.
We import something like, and people that know more about it than me will correct me, but somewhere like 700,000 to 800,000 tons of soybean meal and other meals each year, because we have a lot of livestock, right? So there would be some domestic demand, and there is some slight differences in canola meal versus soybean meal in terms of how you incorporate it into feed. Again, I'm not an expert, but there is domestic demand. And I always feel like commodity markets kind of resolve these things eventually. I guess
they do.
One thing I wanted to sort of push on here was like, what do you think is the best? Nothing's perfect, right? So, but you don't want to let perfection get in the way of progress. If you were decreeing upon high for a country like Australia, would you have mandates? Would you have a version of RINs? Would you do something else? Government, at least maybe some kind of government-backed purchase program. So, X percentage of the defence diesel is going to be, either biodiesel or renewable diesel, or, X percent of domestic flights are going to use locally sourced jet fuel. Same for the Air Force, I guess, to try and at least create some secure demand, which then encourages the investment case. Because, we've had announcements here for 3 or 4 years from some of the energy majors, and nothing's really happened of any significance. I mean, there's people putting announcements saying they're going to produce, 80 million litres of diesel a year, biodiesel or renewable diesel a year or something like that is the latest one in 2030, and that's not even a day's worth of diesel.
I think, I guess my optimal scenario would be to make it tax-free, which is actually what's happening in Europe right now. It's like because of the diesel shortage that Europe is experiencing right now, they're trying to backtrack and basically say, hey, we want all biofuels that are being blended in order to extend our diesel pool or gasoline pool with ethanol to be tax free. So some of the taxes that governments put on fuel are quite significant.
Yeah, huge
And I
here.
think
Yeah.
that so I think that if you pull the tax off, you make biofuels tax free, right? So meaning with no revenue to the government, that gives a significant incentive for the industry to find solutions. So that would be, I think the rinse process, meaning if you want my analysis, the rinse process is very complex. I mean, it took a long time to get it going. I would say that it took almost 10 years to get it moving, right? And I don't think that Australia is playing with that kind of timeline right now. So I think that, it is effective, but it's like a tax in a way, right? So refiners don't like RINs, right? So the biodiesel producers, the HVO producers, they like RINs, but the refiners do not. So I'm much more in favor of a more neutral aspect where you take all the fuel taxes out, and that makes it much, because fuel taxes are enormous even here in the US, right? So, and I see that Europe now is trying to move to that in order to extend the diesel and the gasoline pool. They're saying we need more of the domestic produced biofuels, and what better way than take the taxes out, because then you increase the blends, you can increase the blends. And there's obviously some testing requirements. So how much can you blend? How much biodiesel can you blend in your diesel pool? On average, worldwide, I would say 5% of the diesel pool worldwide has biodiesel. For gasoline, it's close to 10%. Can we go to 20% on biodiesel? Of course we can. But then that means we have to accept a lot of different feedstocks, right? Because there's a trade-off here. So I think on ethanol it's difficult to go over 10%, but I think on biodiesel you can easily go to 20%. So in fact the most ideal blend are 20% blends for biodiesel. So and I've seen in California as much as 35% blends on biodiesel. So there's room to grow, and by taking away the taxes, the revenue from the government, in essence, of course they don't like that. Well, that provides a huge incentive for the industry, so for the distributors, the producer, all along the supply chain, that I think makes it more effective. So, and if I remember, the fuel taxes in Australia are pretty significant.
They're very high, yeah. I mean, there's a way to achieve that here too, because in Australia, diesel has a very high tax on it, as does petrol, so gasoline. Right. But if you are using the diesel for primary production, mining, etc., you don't pay the tax, because the tax is technically supposed to be to pay for roads, right? So if you are using it for private use, which a mining company is, right, they maintain their own roads, they maintain their own infrastructure. Same for agriculture. Essentially, that's not attracting a tax. Now there's all this, here it gets spun as a mining company is getting a tax concession, a farmer's getting a tax concession, when it's basically not. It's just not paying the tax because it's not using the roads. So, that could make, that might be a way to make it make sense. I mean, to me, you need some sort of, like, less government meddling, the better. But if government can mandate demand, so that you create an industry, because the other thing that I think gets lost in this argument is this tying up in knots about carbon intensity. It's like you can have zero carbon intensity if you don't have any diesel to burn in the first place, and your economy shuts down. You'd be very carbon light, right? You don't have anything going, and that's effectively, the reality that we're facing here is, we're overly reliant on the fuels coming from Asia, and that Asian market is dominated by China. And if they don't want to export fuels, which has put the Korean industry, the Japanese industry, the Singapore industry, the refining industry under a lot of pressure, right? Because of the cheap fuels coming out of China. And suddenly if China, so where do we get our fuels from? And so I think a lot of the hand-wringing over carbon intensity of your feedstock kind of gets lost in the fact that we won't be able to maintain our economy, get food to the supermarkets, grow crops, unless we do something, right? And it's extremely frustrating as someone who sort of has seen this coming for a while and was hopeful 3 or 4 years ago. It looked like there was going to be some progress, and we've kind of wasted that in in waiting for the government to make a decision, and they've gone from throwing hundreds of millions of dollars at hydrogen programs that were never going to work in the first place to, hopefully there's some sort of support for renewable fuels or biofuels down here, but it's a long way away. In terms of your business, so you've obviously worked for several different companies over your long career, involved in setting up markets in the Middle East, Asia, and other places. What's keeping you busy today with your own business?
I think that, well, I do mostly consulting, so I talk to people about making decisions like we're talking about, essentially, but mostly from a business standpoint. So where to set up the plant, building a conventional biodiesel plant or building a renewable diesel plant. I help people about feedstock, about choosing the type of feedstock they might want to use, and so I give them advice on that type of thing because my background, I have a strong agricultural background as well. So I give them kind of a wholesome view of what best, where to put your money, and frankly speaking, right now, a lot of investments are happening in the U.S., right? Because the mandate here is very strong. So we've had an increase of close to 25% of the renewable volume obligations, right? So it's a significant ramp up, and therefore there's going to be a lot of capacity that is going to be built, renovated, and optimized. So there is quite a bit of work, So I basically I don't work for everybody, meaning it depends who I want to work with, basically, so I choose my customers very carefully. But most of them are investors from the investment banking sector who really don't know much about the renewable fuel sector. So they don't even know if they want to be in ethanol or if they want to be in biodiesel or renewable diesel, and they certainly do not know the difference between renewable diesel and biodiesel. So there are quite a few projects ongoing right now, and so I don't work full time. I only work part time, and that's why I choose my customers carefully. So because I don't want to get into kind of a full time situation, because I want to take advantage of my life.
Fair enough. Wise
And
words.
I have worked enough in my career that I don't want to go into a sort of a crazy time schedule. So and there's a lot of demand for that right now. To be very
Yeah,
honest,
I was about to ask, has your
there's a
phone been
lot of
ringing off the hook since early March?
yes,
Yeah.
yes, exactly. And people just are asking for a lot of advice right now. And I charge a decent amount of money on a per hour basis right now. So, I'm very comfortable doing that. And I'm just waiting. Meaning if something does come up and that takes me into a more, project management basis, I might consider that, but it would have to be pretty compelling. There's a lot of construction going on in the U.S. right now. So, as you know, on the data center side, it's kind of crazy. So that cost, that the data center construction cost, is actually impacting crushers,
Yeah, can
biodiesel
imagine.
plants. It's impacting everything, So because you can't find trucks, you can't find pumps, you can't find, it's really, not an easy situation right now.
One question before, just related to that. So even before the AI boom really took off in the last 2 or 3 years, the cost of, those plants, feasibility studies that were done, say around 2020, 1920, 2021, and then launched, and then the cost of everything went through the roof thanks to COVID. And then, costs have not gone down since then. In terms of those plants that have been built in the last 3 to 5 years, I know a couple of years ago, when energy prices were lower than where they are now, a lot of those were struggling. How are those projects now? Are they kind of back? There's been some consolidation and restructuring, and I'm assuming they're doing well now. This is the more recent one, so the HVO plants, I guess.
Well, it's interesting you ask that question because what's happening in the marketplace is that the margin, most of the HVO or renewable diesel plants have been built on the Gulf Coast. So they've been built for exports, and they've been built because they are large and they were built by refiners. They were built on the Gulf Coast, and therefore their cost for feedstock is much higher than the conventional biodiesel plants who are based in the Midwest.
Yeah.
So today you have a really strange situation because feedstock prices have gone up tremendously. That the conventional biodiesel margin is now higher than for renewable diesel or HVO, and therefore the Gulf plants are at a disadvantage today.
Wow.
Yes, it's something that I wouldn't have expected, but this is really truly happening. And and again, renewable diesel, because it's a cracker and it's a essentially a real refinery, like a
Yeah,
fossil
it
fuel
is. Yeah.
refinery. You know, your costs are much higher than a conventional biodiesel. Your investments are much higher. So your overall risk package is much higher. So recently the trend, conventional biodiesel has become much more attractive all of a sudden. And this has been happening since only March or so. Yes, it's an interesting trend that I have to say that I didn't see coming. But the speed at which feedstocks have gone up because of the price hikes in fossil fuels have really taken me back, and I see that also happening in Europe. In Europe as well, I see that the choice for very low carbon intensity or high greenhouse gas savings is favors conventional biodiesel plants. And like I was actually mentioning that in my analysis today that I publish every day, that basically Germany in 2025 had a significant increase in the blends from conventional biodiesel, which I also didn't expect. So we have that. This is a new trend. Will it stick? I don't know. But then prices of mineral oils are at an all-time high. So I mean we're in the here in Arizona we're paying $5 a gallon, and I think in Europe they're paying $10 a gallon. So you're paying 10 as
Similar.
similar. Therefore it's difficult to conclude anything right now. With this huge spike in fossil fuels. But I wanted to go back to a point that you made earlier, which I think is a very important point, because this is a point that actually started the renewable fuel standards, is the strategic domestic advantage of having a renewable fuel produced locally. So at the time back in 2006, the reason why the US went into ethanol and went into biodiesel and so on was partly because of that, right? Because at the time fracking had not actually gone crazy, and the US was still a net importer of fuel. That has changed, of course. But I'm seeing renewed interest on that front in the US and also in Europe, where basically people are saying, "Oh yeah, we don't want to be dependent upon other countries for our fuel, right?" And therefore there is a strong trend right now, I think, in terms of strategic domestic production of renewable fuels. And I think that may sell better today than like it did back in 2006. In fact, I would say that was one of the reasons why the RFS was anchored and in the U.S., because the U.S. industry did not want to go for a renewable fuel standard, but the strategic domestic supply was a strong factor because it was post Iraq War.
Yeah, the timing was good, right?
Yeah, the
And
timing was
I think
perfect.
it was you mentioning recently too in our offline discussions, similarly so in Brazil with its ethanol capacity from sugar, right? From
Yes.
issues in the 70s with the oil crisis back then and other issues they've had over the years with fuel availability really got the ethanol industry there. That's probably the best example of sugar-based ethanol globally,
Yeah.
and
No,
very
you're right.
dynamic industry.
Yeah, you're right. Brazil is the model because after the 1973, Brazil didn't have any choice. They didn't have any oil production or anything. In 1973, when they got hit, they were importing everything. They had to do something. And they decided, hey, we're going to use sugarcane ethanol to run our cars. And they have never let up from that. So today at the pump in Brazil, you have a choice of either 100% ethanol or a blend with gasoline of 27% ethanol. There's no other choice. Of course, diesel, but even the diesel is blend. They have a blend of biodiesel at 16% today. But since 1974, Brazil has introduced ethanol engines in cars, and they have forced the automobile industry to produce these flex fuel cars. And I believe that almost 99% of all new cars are flex fuel, right? So you can either put this blend of 27% ethanol or 100% ethanol. So, Brazil is the largest, I would say, biofuels market in the world, right? By far, if you combine it with ethanol.
Yeah, it's impressive. Right? Excellent. Well, I know we've clocked up an hour, and I know your time is precious, but this has been fantastic. Just for the benefit of our listeners, how can people get in touch with you? I know I subscribe to your Substack, but do you have a website as well?
Yes, I have a website, and it's globalbiodiesel.com. And I publish my comments almost every day, and on the markets, global markets. Sometimes it's a little technical because I touch upon the energy situation as well. But yes, and I try to concentrate on how it impacts biodiesel and renewable diesel.
Excellent. Well, thank you for your time. Really appreciate it. And we'll have to pick up the discussion, hopefully, when Australia makes a giant announcement that they're launching a biofuel policy.
Well, I
Keep
hope
hoping.
so.
It might be in 50
Yeah,
years.
exactly. I hope so.
All right. Thanks a lot, Henri.
Thanks, Henri. Bye-bye.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the GSX podcast. You can find out more about GSX at greatsouthernx.com and follow us on X at GSX Commodities. You can also follow me, Henry Walsh, at H2Walsh. Until next time.